TSA agent ripped black woman's expensive dress for fun, unaware her husband is a judge. What started as a cruel and humiliating act in a crowded airport quickly escalated into a fight for justice that would expose systemic bias and hold those in power accountable. Little did the agent know, the woman he demeaned wasn't just a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. The airport was alive with its usual symphony of chaos. Children's cries mingling with the hum of announcements, hurried footsteps echoing on polished tiles, and the occasional screech of luggage wheels. Amid the throng of travelers, Ava Daniels strode with an air of quiet elegance that turned a few heads. She was dressed in a fitted navy dress, its fabric flowing just above her knees, and a pearl necklace glimmered against her smooth brown skin. Her heels clicked softly as she moved, exuding the kind of confidence that comes from years of carving her place in the world. Ava wasn't just anyone. She was a partner at a prestigious law firm, known for her keen intellect and poise under pressure. Today's trip was a blend of work and celebration, a chance to close a major deal and spend the weekend commemorating her 10th wedding anniversary. Her husband, James Daniels, a highly respected judge, had encouraged her to take the early flight and relax before the event. As she neared the TSA checkpoint, Ava's gaze lingered momentarily on the crowd. A frazzled mother juggled her baby in a stroller, while a group of college students laughed loudly, likely heading off to spring break. The world moved in disarray around her, but Ava maintained her composure, clutching her designer handbag and rolling a small suitcase beside her. The line for security snaked forward, and Ava took her place. She prepared for the usual drill: shoes off, electronics out, liquids in clear bags. She was no stranger to travel, but there was always an underlying tension at this stage, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. As she reached the front of the line, a TSA agent motioned her forward. His name tag read R. Whitman, and he stood with his arms crossed, his expression stern. Whitman was a man in his mid-40s, with a buzz cut that seemed to accentuate the sharpness of his features. His uniform was immaculate, but there was something unsettling in the way his eyes scanned passengers, as if searching for flaws to exploit. "Step forward," he barked, his tone grating and impatient. Ava nodded politely, placing her belongings into the gray plastic bins. She slipped off her heels and placed them neatly alongside her laptop and handbag. "Anything else?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Whitman didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on her, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face before he spoke. "You sure you're not hiding anything?" The question caught her off guard. "Excuse me?" He smirked, gesturing toward the scanner. "Go ahead. We'll see soon enough." Ava's heart tightened. She had encountered microaggressions before, subtle slights that were easy to brush off. But there was something in Whitman's tone that made her skin prickle. She held her head high and walked through the body scanner, standing still as the machine did its job. "Ma'am, step to the side," Whitman said as she exited the scanner. His voice carried the authority of someone who enjoyed wielding power. "Is there a problem?" Ava asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Routine check," he replied curtly, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. Ava complied, stepping to the designated area. She glanced around, noticing other passengers watching the interaction with curiosity. Some turned away quickly, unwilling to engage, while others whispered behind cupped hands. Whitman began his inspection with unnecessary roughness, patting down her arms and torso in a manner that felt invasive. Ava's breath caught when he tugged sharply at the hem of her dress, as though testing its durability. "Careful," she exclaimed, stepping back instinctively. He ignored her protest, his smirk widening. "Looks expensive. Wouldn't want to damage it, huh?" Ava's cheeks burned with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She wanted to speak up, to assert her rights, but the weight of the stares around her kept her frozen. Whitman leaned closer, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. "Some people think they can get away with anything," he muttered, loud enough for only her to hear. Tears stung Ava's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let him see her crumble. She clenched her fists tightly, her nails digging into her palms. After a few more moments of unnecessary handling, Whitman stepped back, clearly satisfied with the scene he had created. "You're clear," he said nonchalantly, motioning her toward the conveyor belt. Ava quickly grabbed her belongings, her hands trembling as she slipped on her shoes. She felt the sting of humiliation settle deep within her chest, a pain sharper than anything she'd expected that morning. As she walked away, she could still hear the faint murmurs of other travelers and see Whitman's smug expression etched in her memory. But Ava Daniels was not one to let injustice go unanswered. Her husband's voice echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Gather the facts. And when the time comes, make your move. With her chin held high, Ava made a silent vow. This would not end here. Ava Daniels stood silently in the designated search area, her arms stiff at her sides. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, her calm composure beginning to crack as TSA agent R. Whitman loomed over her with an air of smug authority. The bustling sounds of the airport seemed distant now, replaced by the tension of the moment. Whitman snapped on a fresh pair of latex gloves, the sharp snap of the rubber seeming louder than it should have been. His face bore the same smirk that had unsettled her earlier, his gaze lingering a moment too long on her tailored dress. The other passengers had moved on, but a few remained nearby, their stolen glances laced with curiosity and discomfort. This is just a standard check, Whitman drawled, though his tone made it clear that he considered her anything but standard. You know how it is. Safety first. Ava kept her voice steady, masking her unease. I've been through security countless times. I know the process. His smirk widened. Then you know the drill. Hold still. The search began with calculated indifference, his hands moving firmly across her arms and shoulders. Ava winced as he tugged her arms outward, forcing her into an awkward stance. The invasive nature of his actions was amplified by the deliberate slowness of his movements, as though he were reveling in her discomfort. When Whitman moved to her lower back, he pulled sharply at the fabric of her dress. The delicate material bunched under his grip. Careful, Ava exclaimed, twisting slightly. You're going to ruin it. Whitman chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. Relax. It's just a dress. Ava's cheeks flushed, not from anger alone, but from the growing awareness of the stares boring into her. A man seated nearby looked away guiltily when she caught his eye, while a young woman whispered to her companion. Every moment stretched unbearably, the weight of the public spectacle pressing heavily on Ava's shoulders. Stand still, Whitman ordered sharply, his tone devoid of any pretense of professionalism now. Ava's hands balled into fists. She wanted to snap back, to demand an end to the needless aggression, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. Years of navigating spaces where her very presence was questioned had taught her restraint. Still, there was something different about this moment. Something raw and personal about the way Whitman's hands lingered on the zipper of her dress. I told you, don't move, he barked, his grip tightening suddenly. With a harsh yank, he pulled at her dress's side seam. A sickening sound followed, the sharp, unmistakable tear of fabric giving way. Ava gasped, instinctively clutching the torn material as it fluttered loosely against her side. Her dress, the expensive one she'd bought specifically for this trip, now hung open at the seam, exposing the smooth skin of her thigh. Are you kidding me? Ava's voice broke with disbelief. Whitman didn't even flinch. Instead, he shrugged, his smirk still firmly in place. I told you to stay still. Not my fault if you can't follow instructions. Tears stung at Ava's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Around her, the world seemed to freeze. She could feel the stares intensify, the sharp whispers blending into an overwhelming hum of judgment. A child nearby asked loudly, Mommy, what happened to her dress? The mother quickly shushed the child and hurried away, avoiding Ava's eyes. You're telling me this? Ava gestured toward her torn dress, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. Is my fault? Whitman folded his arms, the latex gloves creaking slightly. Like I said, ma'am, just doing my job. Your job doesn't include ripping someone's clothing, Ava shot back, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain composed. Whitman leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a condescending whisper. You people always think you're above the rules. Ava recoiled as if she'd been slapped. The words were so casually venomous, delivered without hesitation or shame. Her mind raced with responses, but her mouth stayed dry, the shock and fury robbing her of speech. Other TSA agents glanced over now, their faces unreadable. None of them intervened. Whitman's smirk deepened, emboldened by the silence of his colleagues. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Ava demanded, her voice firm but shaky. Whitman shrugged again. "You're welcome to file a complaint. Line's over there." He gestured vaguely toward the customer service desk several gates away. Ava pulled her blazer from her bag, draping it awkwardly over the torn section of her dress. Her hands shook as she zipped her bag closed. Around her, the crowd continued to shift and gawk, their muted murmurs amplifying her sense of isolation. "You don't get to treat people like this," Ava said, her voice low but firm. Whitman rolled his eyes. "Maybe next time. Think twice before causing trouble." She stared at him, her chest heaving with suppressed fury. For a moment, she imagined grabbing his radio and shouting for someone, anyone, to step in and acknowledge the blatant injustice of what had just happened. But the same thought that always held her back rose again. What good would it do? With one last glance at Whitman, Ava turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill over. The murmurs followed her like a cloud, but she refused to let them break her stride. Inside, though, Ava was unraveling. The fabric of her dress wasn't the only thing torn. Her dignity, her confidence, and her sense of safety all felt shredded, exposed to the judgment of strangers and the cruelty of a man drunk on his own power. As she reached the gate, Ava sank into a chair, pulling her phone from her bag with trembling fingers. She stared at the screen for a moment, willing herself to calm down before dialing. The first ring felt eternal, but when James's voice answered on the other end, steady and calm, the dam broke. "James," she began, her voice cracking as tears finally streamed down her face. "You're not going to believe what just happened." On the other end, Judge James Daniels listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, he spoke in the measured tone he always used when something required swift and deliberate action. "Stay where you are," he said firmly. "I'm going to handle this." Ava nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Despite the humiliation, a flicker of resolve ignited in her chest. Whitman had underestimated her, but he wouldn't get away with it. As she sat there, adjusting her blazer over her torn dress, Ava made a silent vow. She would not let this moment define her, and Whitman would soon learn who he had just tried to humiliate. Ava Daniels hurried down the terminal, clutching her blazer over the torn side of her dress. Her heels clicked against the glossy floor, but the sound was drowned out by the noise in her head. Whitman's condescending words, the whispers of strangers, and the ripping sound that seemed to echo over and over in her mind. She found a corner near a sparsely populated seating area where she could sink into a chair and attempt to compose herself. Her breathing was ragged, and her hands shook as she adjusted her blazer, trying to cover the exposed fabric. She felt raw, as though the TSA agent hadn't just ripped her dress, but had stripped away her dignity, layer by layer, in front of dozens of watchful eyes. Ava couldn't stop the thoughts racing through her mind. Why me? Why does this keep happening? She'd worked so hard to build her life, to climb every rung on the ladder despite the unspoken rules designed to keep her and people like her out. She thought of the countless small slights and microaggressions she'd endured over the years. The clerk who assumed she couldn't afford the designer bag, the client who had mistaken her for an assistant, and now this. This was different, though. This wasn't subtle or covert. It was blatant and cruel, a deliberate act to humiliate her, to remind her of her place, as if she didn't belong in first class, in her tailored dress, or even in this airport. You people always think you're above the rules. Whitman's words replayed in her mind like a taunt, each repetition digging deeper into her chest. She wiped at her eyes quickly, not wanting to smudge her makeup. You're not going to let him win, she told herself, but the tears threatened to fall anyway. She'd built a life on strength and composure, but the weight of this moment was suffocating. As Ava adjusted her bag, she noticed a couple across the aisle stealing glances at her. The man leaned over to whisper something to his companion, who looked at Ava briefly before shaking her head. Their eyes darted away when Ava met their gaze, as though they'd been caught witnessing something they shouldn't have seen. A young woman with a baby in her arms passed by, hesitating for a brief moment before continuing down the hall. Ava thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in the woman's eyes, but it was fleeting. Most people moved on, pretending not to notice her, their expressions a mix of discomfort and apathy. The sound of a suitcase rolling to a stop caught Ava's attention. She turned to see a middle-aged black woman standing a few feet away, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" the woman asked softly, her voice steady but kind. Ava hesitated. The question, though simple, threatened to open the floodgates she was barely holding back. She nodded quickly, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm fine," she lied, though the tears welling in her eyes betrayed her. The woman glanced at Ava's torn dress, then back at her face. "That wasn't right. What happened back there?" she said, her tone firm. Ava blinked, taken aback by the directness of her words. She opened her mouth to respond, but the woman shook her head. "You don't have to explain. I saw the whole thing. People like him think they can treat us any kind of way." Ava swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." The woman reached into her carry-on and pulled out a light shawl. "Here," she said, handing it over. "This should help until you can change." Ava stared at the shawl for a moment before accepting it, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. The woman offered a small, supportive smile before walking away, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The act of kindness was small, but it meant everything. Ava draped the shawl over her shoulders, the soft fabric providing both physical and emotional comfort. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of strength returning. A few feet away, a teenage boy sat scrolling on his phone, his headphones draped around his neck. He glanced up at Ava, his expression a mixture of awkwardness and guilt. My mom says that guy shouldn't have done that to you," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. She was really mad. Ava managed a faint smile. "Tell your mom I appreciate that," she said gently. The boy nodded, looking relieved, before returning his attention to his phone. These moments of support were brief, but enough to remind Ava that she wasn't alone, even in a space designed to isolate her. Still, the humiliation lingered, heavy and unshakable. She thought of James's voice on the phone earlier, his steady resolve. "Stay where you are, I'm going to handle this." Ava sighed, her emotions shifting between anger and exhaustion. The humiliation burned hot, but beneath it was a quieter, colder resolve. She wasn't just humiliated, she was furious. Furious at the system that allowed people like Whitman to wield unchecked power. Furious at the bystanders who stayed silent. And furious that she had to fight battles like this over and over again. But Ava Daniels was not the type to wallow in anger. She was the type to act. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the shawl, and took a deep breath. Whitman might have torn her dress, but he hadn't touched her dignity. And soon, he would learn that. As the intercom announced boarding for her flight, Ava stood and gathered her things. Her heart still ached, and her hands were still unsteady, but she would move forward. Because people like Whitman only won when people like her gave up. And Ava Daniels never gave up. James Daniels stood in his study, the soft light from the desk lamp casting a golden glow over the leather-bound books that lined the shelves. He had just finished reading a brief for an upcoming case when his phone vibrated on the desk. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered, seeing Ava's name. "Hey, sweetheart," he said warmly, leaning back in his chair. But instead of her usual calm and collected tone, he was met with silence. A deep breath, followed by the sound of her voice, trembling and raw. "James," she began, her words cracking under the weight of emotion. I don't even know where to start." James straightened in his chair, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with worry. As Ava recounted the events at the airport, the condescending words, the invasive pat-down, the deliberate tearing of her dress, James listened intently, his jaw tightening with every detail. He could hear the pain in her voice, the humiliation she'd endured. When she described the TSA agent's smirk, the blatant disrespect laced with racism, James closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm for her sake. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said gently when she finished, his voice a soothing balm against her frayed nerves. "Where are you now?" "I'm at the gate," she said softly. "I'm okay, but I can't stop thinking about it. It's not just about me. It's about everything, every time this happens to someone like us." James's grip on the armrest tightened. He was no stranger to injustice. As a judge, he had spent years fighting for fairness in a system that often seemed stacked against people of color. But hearing his wife's anguish struck a different chord, a personal one. "You did nothing wrong, Ava," he said firmly, "and I promise you, we're not letting this go." There was a brief pause before she replied, her voice steadier now. "I knew you'd say that." As James hung up, he sat in the quiet of his study, his mind already racing with how to proceed. Ava's resilience was one of the many things he admired about her, but he also knew how deeply moments like these could cut, leaving invisible scars. His thoughts drifted back to when they first met, both fresh out of law school and eager to take on the world. Ava had walked into the courtroom as a young public defender, her presence commanding respect even then. James had been mesmerized by her confidence, the way she fought tirelessly for her clients, many of whom society had written off. Their relationship had blossomed quickly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. They both understood what it meant to navigate a world where their achievements were often questioned, their successes attributed to quotas rather than talent. Together, they had weathered countless storms, from professional challenges to personal attacks. Through it all, Ava had been his rock, her strength and grace inspiring him every day. One memory in particular stood out. Early in their marriage, they had attended a gala at an exclusive country club. Ava, dressed in a stunning emerald gown, had been stopped by a server who mistook her for the help. James had watched as Ava corrected the man with poise, her voice calm but firm. Later that night, she had laughed about it, brushing it off as just another example of living while black. But James had seen the hurt in her eyes, even as she tried to hide it. "She deserves better," he whispered to himself now, his resolve hardening. James reached for his laptop and began drafting a formal complaint. He wasn't just Ava's husband. He was a judge, with connections and influence that could shine a light on the injustice she'd faced. He would make sure this didn't get swept under the rug. Ava arrived home hours later, exhausted, but relieved to see James waiting for her in the foyer. He enveloped her in a warm embrace, his arms a fortress of safety and comfort. "How are you feeling?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Tired," she admitted, "but I'm okay now." They sat together in the living room, Ava recounting the story in more detail, her voice steadier now than it had been on the phone. James listened intently, nodding occasionally but letting her speak without interruption. When she finished, he leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "Ava, you didn't deserve any of that," he said. "And Whitman needs to be held accountable, not just for you but for everyone else he's treated this way." Ava nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "What's the plan?" James smiled faintly. "I've already started. I filed a formal complaint with TSA, and I'm reaching out to some contacts in the Department of Transportation. We're going to make sure this is investigated thoroughly." She exhaled, the weight of the day beginning to lift. "Thank you," she said softly. James cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You don't have to thank me. You've always fought for what's right, for your clients, for our community. Now it's my turn to fight for you." Ava leaned into him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. She knew this was far from over, but with James by her side, she felt stronger. Together they had faced discrimination before, and together they would face it again. As the evening wore on, they discussed next steps, James's calm resolve balancing Ava's fiery determination. By the time they went to bed, their plan was set in motion. A plan that would ensure the TSA agent and the system that enabled him were held accountable. Injustice might have tried to strip Ava of her dignity that day, but with James at her side, she knew one thing for certain. Her voice would be heard. The sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room at the airport administration building was a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal outside. Ava and James Daniels sat side by side at the long oak table, a united front against the injustice they were determined to confront. Across from them sat two senior TSA supervisors, and a representative from the airport's management team. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. James, ever the composed judge, folded his hands neatly on the table. His presence was calm, but authoritative, commanding respect with every movement. Ava sat tall beside him, her earlier humiliation tempered by the quiet resolve burning in her chest. "I believe we're all here for the same reason," James began, his deep, measured voice cutting through the tension. "To address the blatant misconduct my wife endured at the hands of one of your TSA agents." The head supervisor, a graying man with tired eyes, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mr. Daniels, we take these matters very seriously. If you could provide a detailed account of the incident, we'll ensure it's thoroughly investigated." Ava spoke clearly and calmly, recounting every detail. The unnecessary pat-down, the aggressive handling, the humiliating tear of her dress, and the agent's mocking tone. As she spoke, the supervisors exchanged uneasy glances, but James's piercing gaze kept them focused. When Ava finished, James leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. "I trust there are security cameras in the checkpoint area?" The supervisors nodded hesitantly. "Good," James continued. "Then there should be no issue reviewing the footage to verify my wife's account." The representative from airport management, a younger woman with sharp features, quickly interjected. "Of course, Judge Daniels, we'll retrieve the footage immediately. However, it's important we also hear from the agent involved. R. Whitman, I believe." At that moment, the door opened, and Whitman himself entered, his uniform neatly pressed and his expression carefully neutral. He avoided looking at Ava as he took a seat, his movements stiff. "Agent Whitman," the head supervisor began, "we've received a complaint regarding your handling of a passenger earlier today. Mrs. Daniels has made some serious allegations. Do you have anything to say in response?" Whitman folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "With all due respect, I was just doing my job," he said, his tone defensive. "The passenger was acting uncooperative during the search. I followed protocol." Ava's eyes narrowed. "Uncooperative? I complied with every request you made, despite the way you spoke to me. You ripped my dress in front of everyone." Whitman's smirk returned briefly before he masked it with a frown. "That was an accident," he said, his tone dismissive. "I already explained this to her at the time." James's voice cut through like a blade. "Your explanation is insufficient, Agent Whitman. An accident doesn't excuse the condescension or the blatant disregard for basic professionalism." The tension in the room thickened as the airport representative gestured to one of the supervisors, who stepped out briefly. A few minutes later, he returned with a tablet in hand. "We've retrieved the footage," he announced. Everyone leaned in as the video played. The grainy footage showed the checkpoint, where Ava could be seen standing with grace and composure as Whitman barked orders. The search began, and the subtle aggression in his movements was clear, even in the distant footage. When Whitman pulled at her dress, the sharp movement caused the fabric to tear, leaving Ava clutching at the material as he stepped back with a smirk. The room fell silent. "Would you care to explain this, Agent Whitman?" the supervisor asked, his tone icy. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado faltering. "Like I said, it was an accident," he mumbled. "And I wasn't smirking. I don't know why it looks like that on camera." James leaned forward, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "What about the part where you told my wife, 'You people think you're above the rules'? Was that also an accident?" Whitman's face reddened, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. "I don't recall saying that," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The supervisor exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Enough. This footage speaks for itself. Agent Whitman, your behavior is unacceptable and violates our code of conduct. You're suspended effective immediately, pending further review." Whitman opened his mouth to protest, but one look at the supervisor's expression silenced him. He stood abruptly and left the room, his shoulders tense with anger and shame. The airport representative turned to Ava and James, her expression earnest. "Mrs. Daniels, on behalf of the airport and TSA, I deeply apologize for what you experienced today. This behavior is not reflective of our values, and we will ensure steps are taken to prevent incidents like this in the future. Ava nodded slowly, her voice steady. I hope you mean that, because no one else should have to go through what I did. James added, we'll be following up to ensure this matter is resolved appropriately, and I trust there will be additional sensitivity training for your staff moving forward. Absolutely, the representative agreed. As they left the conference room, Ava felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The day's events had scarred her, but seeing Whitman held accountable and knowing her voice had been heard brought a sense of closure. James placed a comforting hand on her back as they walked through the terminal. You handled that with grace, he said softly. She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. We handled it together. And together, they walked toward the future, knowing they had taken a stand not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. Ava Daniels sat in the same conference room where the confrontation had taken place just a few days earlier. This time, however, the tension was replaced by a quiet resolve. Next to her, James exuded his usual calm authority, his presence as steadying as it was empowering. Across the table sat a group of senior TSA and airport officials, their postures rigid and expressions tinged with discomfort. The head supervisor cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence. Mrs. Daniels, Judge Daniels, thank you for meeting with us again. After a thorough review of the incident, including video footage and witness statements, we have concluded that Agent Whitman's actions were in clear violation of our code of conduct. Ava nodded, her expression unreadable. We've taken appropriate disciplinary action, the supervisor continued. Effective immediately, Agent Whitman has been terminated from his position. Additionally, we've escalated this case to our legal team to address any further accountability. James leaned forward slightly. And what about systemic changes? His tone was firm but measured. My wife's experience isn't unique. What steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen to others? The airport's director, a composed woman in a tailored blazer, spoke up. Judge Daniels, you're absolutely right. This incident highlighted serious gaps in our staff training and oversight. As part of our response, we're implementing mandatory diversity, equity, and sensitivity training for all employees. We're also introducing stricter monitoring at checkpoints to prevent abuses of power. Ava listened intently, her emotions swirling. On the surface, it was the resolution she had hoped for, justice served, accountability acknowledged, and promises of change. But beneath it all, the sting of public humiliation remained. No formal apology or systemic overhaul could erase the memory of Whitman's smirk or the whispers of strangers as she clutched at her torn dress. We also want to extend our sincerest apologies, the director continued, her tone softer now. Mrs. Daniels, what you experienced was unacceptable and does not reflect the values we strive to uphold. I can't imagine how humiliating that must have been, and for that, we are truly sorry. Ava met the woman's gaze, searching for sincerity. She found a flicker of it there, but the apology still felt distant, polished and professional, as though it had been practiced in front of a mirror. Thank you, Ava said finally, her voice calm but firm. I appreciate the steps you're taking, but understand this. Words alone won't repair what happened. Actions will. The director nodded. Understood. As they left the meeting, Ava felt a complicated mix of emotions. James walked beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. You okay? He asked quietly. I think so, she replied, though her voice wavered. It's hard to feel completely okay after something like this. James stopped and turned to her, his eyes full of empathy. What he did doesn't define you, Ava. You're stronger than that. She offered a faint smile, nodding. I know, but it's not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated like this and didn't have someone to fight for them. James tightened his hold on her hand. That's why we did what we did, and because of you, there's now one less person in a position to abuse their power. Ava exhaled deeply, allowing herself a moment to absorb his words. She thought about the people who had shown quiet support that day, the woman who had given her a shawl, the teenage boy who had stammered out his solidarity. Those moments of kindness had reminded her that not everyone turned a blind eye, but the journey wasn't over. This wasn't the first time Ava had faced discrimination, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, the outcome of this battle gave her hope that change, though slow, was possible. As they exited the airport, Ava glanced back at the bustling terminal. Her dress had been mended, but the invisible scars of that day remained. Yet she knew they wouldn't hold her back. Instead, they would fuel her resolve to continue fighting for dignity and justice, not just for herself, but for everyone. Because Ava Daniels wasn't just a victim of one man's prejudice. She was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in moments of humiliation, dignity could be reclaimed, and justice, though delayed, could be delivered. The evening air was crisp as Ava and James sat together on the back porch of their home, the glow of the setting sun painting the horizon in warm hues. A blanket draped over their legs, and the sound of distant crickets filled the silence between them. Ava cradled a steaming cup of tea, her fingers tracing the rim absently as she stared out at the tranquil garden. "It's been a lot," Ava said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried the weight of the past few days, but also a newfound steadiness. James nodded, his hand finding hers. "It has. But you've handled it with strength and grace, just like you always do." She smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." Together, they reflected on the whirlwind of events. The public humiliation, the tense confrontation, and finally, the resolution. It had been exhausting, but it also brought them closer, reaffirming their shared belief in justice and perseverance. The media had picked up the story, headlines decrying racial profiling and praising Ava's courage. Discussions about systemic bias in airport security were gaining momentum, with calls for greater accountability and transparency. Ava had seen the news segments and social media posts, her name often mentioned alongside words like dignity and resilience. "I don't want this to just fade away," Ava said, her voice firm. "This fight is bigger than me. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." James smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "You will. And I'll be right here, fighting with you." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Ava felt a sense of calm wash over her. The pain of that day lingered, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to reclaim her confidence, her dignity, and to advocate for those who couldn't fight back. Hope, after all, was the strongest armor she had. If Ava's story moved you, join the conversation about racial profiling and systemic bias by sharing this story. Let's amplify voices like Ava's and work toward a world where dignity and respect are rights, not privileges. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire justice and change. Together, we can make a difference.